Hello and welcome to the Enhancing Your English podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Demi, and today is episode 1, which is numbers. Now, in English, there are many prefixes that are related to numbers. Now, a prefix is basically the first part of some words, and many of them come from Latin. Now, we're not going to go into every prefix that relates to a number, but for today, just some of the most common ones. For example, when you see uni at the beginning of a word in English, uni comes from Latin and it means one. And you may have seen this in some English words. For example, I can say there's one universe, or that every person is unique, meaning there's only one of you in the world. United means bringing different groups together into one, and also in the mythical animal unicorn. In this case, uni means one, and corn means horn, which is what a unicorn has. Now, for the number 2, there are 2 prefixes you might see. Probably the more common one is bi. Now, bi comes from Latin, and you may see this in words like bicycle, which has 2 wheels, or bilingual, which means knowing 2 languages. But you also may see di. Now, di comes from Greek, and you may see this in words like carbon dioxide, CO2. In this case, carbon is the C, and dioxide means that there are 2 oxygen atoms that make up the O2. Also, dilemma means having 2 choices, and maybe both choices are bad. In Japanese, this word is translated into katakana as jirenma. Next we have tri. Tri means 3, and you can see this in words like tricycle, which has 3 wheels, and triangle, which has 3 sides. Now I'm going to skip ahead to oct. Oct means 8, and you can see this in octopus, which has 8 legs or tentacles, and also in the month October. Now next we have dis or dec. This means 10, and it's a very similar root in both Latin and Greek. You can see this in words like decade, which means 10 years, and also in the month December. Next we have cent, and cent means 100. You can see this, for example, in century, which means 100 years. Also in centimeter, which is 1/100th of a meter. And also, for example, in American or Canadian or Australian money, there are 100 cents in a dollar. Now, for 1,000, you may see 2 prefixes. The first is mil or milli. Now, this comes from Latin, and you might see this in words like millimeter, which is 1/1000th of a meter, or in millennium, which means 1,000 years, and also in the number million. Now, that might sound a little bit strange because we know that 1 million has 6 zeros in it. But basically the idea means that in a million there are 1,000 thousands, and that's where the root comes from. Now the second prefix for thousand is kilo, and kilo comes from the Greek. You can see this, for example, in words like kilometer, which is 1,000 meters, or kilogram, 1,000 grams. And you can also see this in the United States in slang. For example, if you see a sentence like his salary is $50K, that means he makes $50,000 a year. The K means 1,000. Now, okay, you might be looking at this list and thinking, wait a minute, you just said that oct means 8, like in October, and dis means 10, like in December, but October is the 10th month of the year, and December is the 12th. That it doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. Well, there is a reason for that. You see, the calendar of 12 months that we use today in English is very, very, very old. It comes from ancient Roman times, but the original Roman calendar only had 10 months. In that calendar, there was no January and no February. And there were basically no names for this winter period. So actually, in the old calendar, the first month was March, and it continued on to the 10th month, December. So actually, in this naming, the sept in September means 7, oct means 8, nov means 9, and dis means 10. About 2,700 years ago, January and February were added to the calendar, making a total of 12 months. So the numbering of the months changed, but not the names. So that's why the original meanings of October and December don't match up with their month number today. Now, just as a side note, some of you probably also know that July and August were not the original names of what is today the 7th and 8th months. But we're going to talk about the months in a little bit more detail in a later podcast. So please just be patient with that for right now. Now, something that's, maybe not so important, but something that I thought was kind of interesting when I was doing the research for this was how they decided on the names for the metric system in measuring length and weight. Now, we've already talked about some of these word roots, but just so you know, the first three, kilo, hecto, and deca, come from the Greek. The bottom three, dis, cent, or centi, and milli, come from the Latin. Maybe not so important thing, but just kind of a random fact that I thought was interesting that they used both the Greek and Latin in naming these words. Now, okay, for many of my students, something that's not so easy for them at first is reading big numbers in English. Now, usually the first time I would ask them to read a big number, what I see them trying to count it out in Japanese style, man, juman, hyakuman, and then trying to change it into English. Now, I think that's too hard, and I think there's an easier way to do it. Now, in my opinion, all you really need to remember is what to say for each comma, kanma in Japanese, that you see in the number. So for the first comma, just remember to say 1,000. For the second one, say million. The third one, say billion. And the next one, say trillion. And then just cut the parts and read each part of the number. So for this number, this would be 12 trillion, 345 billion, 678 million, 901,230. So just remember what to say for each comma, divide the number up, and read each part. And while most numbers you see probably won't be as large as this one, you might be wondering, how am I going to remember billion and trillion and which one is which? Well, again, just remember that the bi means 2 and the tri means 3. And that should help you a little in remembering the order. Now, okay, before we finish for today, there's one last thing I'd like to mention about big numbers. Now, let's say, for example, that you're talking about the age of the universe, which scientists currently guess is about this many years old. Now, there are two ways that you can say this number. Now, of course, like we said before, we can read this as 13,800,000,000. But if you're reading an internet article or a newspaper or magazine, you might see this number written differently. Because in an article, it's going to be too long to write out 13,800,000,000, and they probably are not going to write out so many zeros. So in that case, you're probably going to see it written like this, 13.8 billion. Now, it means the same as the first one, but in an article, that's probably how they're going to write it out to make it shorter. Well, thank you very much for listening to this first episode of the Enhancing Your English podcast. If you have any comments or questions, you can contact me at kevin@enhancingyourenglish.com. Now, I haven't set up a website yet, but hopefully we'll get that going sometime in the future. So thanks for listening, and good luck enhancing your English.